Hello! Welcome back. It's me, Mr. Denny, here to talk some more history. We've become official now. I've got Mr. Denny's Fun E-Classroom. That's where we're at, huh? How about that sign? And then, what is the subject for today? This gentleman right here, Richard Nixon. I guess we have him on the screen too, so you didn't need the picture here, but you can see there. We're talking about Richard Nixon and the Watergate Scandal. Hopefully you've got your lecture notes. If you don't, make sure you go back to my haiku page, get those lecture notes, Google Doc, PDF, maybe you printed it, whatever is your preference. Let me shrink my little bubble here. So we're talking Richard Nixon and the Watergate Scandal. You've probably heard Watergate before, or at least you've heard like something gate before. We've had some different kind of gate scandals over the past few years. There was Donut Gate. Ariana Grande, she grabbed the donut and she licked it and then she put it back. We had Gamergate. There was Deflategate, right? So people like to take a scandal, throw gate at the end. Where does that come from? To get to the bottom of that, we have to go back, review a little bit about the election of 1968. Now, as you'll remember from the last lecture, Nixon and Humphrey are kind of the two major candidates here. Nixon wins the election of 1968, and he wins by a very slim margin, right? If we look at the popular vote here, Nixon wins 43.2, Humphrey 42.6. Very narrow victory, but nonetheless, Nixon wins. And out of that 1968 election, we also saw some backlash against those more liberal movements, the hippie movements. We see that there is a sizable majority of people in the country who fall into what Nixon calls the silent majority, or the great silent majority. Kind of white conservatives who aren't out there to protest, but who nonetheless support the Vietnam War, as well as many other kind of conservative measures that Nixon was campaigning on. And what is Nixon's first term like? Well, remember the Vietnam War, still happening. We're still in the Cold War. Cold War is still a thing. He expands the Vietnam War out into Laos and Cambodia, right? So he's expanding bombing out into Laos and Cambodia secretly, right? Still, actually, the American people don't realize that even though we've pulled out our troops, we're still continuing the Vietnam War. He also begins to show signs of this kind of secrecy, this kind of paranoia that kind of lasted throughout Nixon's presidency by ordering the IRS, the tax people, and the FBI to surveil and monitor war protesters. So people who are protesting against the war, the hippies, the yippies, people who were against the Vietnam War, being very vocal about it. Nixon orders these people to be very closely watched. And he also, speaking of the Vietnam War and protesters, he tries to suppress the Pentagon Papers. What are the Pentagon Papers? Great question. So the Pentagon Papers are some documents that showed the government had lied about what was happening in Vietnam, had lied about the causes of the Vietnam War. You might remember Gulf of Tonkin, right? We're thinking about the causes of Vietnam. It showed that the government lied about it, that the government was still lying to the American people about the status of the war, and also showed that the government believed that they could not win the Vietnam War, right? So it basically showed, these papers exposed the Vietnam War. How did the people find out about this? Well, there's a guy named Daniel Ellsberg, you see here in the picture. Daniel Ellsberg, he's working for the government. He's given these documents, and he's asked, hey, can you analyze these documents, get back to us, kind of tell us what you think. He reads these, he's like, oh no, the American people need to find out about this. So he tries to give these papers over to the New York Times. The New York Times tries to publish them. Nixon tries to stop them. He tries to sue the New York Times, goes up to the Supreme Court. It's found that, hey, the New York Times has every right to publish these papers. They do. And so kind of right off the bat during Nixon's first time, we're beginning to see this battle between Nixon and his need to keep government activity secret, and the American people trying to find out the truth. So in response to this whole Pentagon Papers incident, Nixon forms the White House Plumbers. Let me move my little bubble here so you can see their names. You got G. Gordon Liddy, E. Howard Hunt. Who are these guys? Well, these are some former FBI, former CIA supporters of Nixon, and they are formed to essentially stop leaks. Now, Plumbers is not their official name. It kind of comes out during this press conference where they're asked, "What's your purpose?" And they're like, "We stop leaks." And then a reporter's like, "Oh, like a plumber." Everyone laughs, and they're like, "Ha ha ha." They're trying to help lie to the American people. So they're called the Plumbers because they try to stop leaks. And how do they do that? Well, one example is Daniel Ellsberg. He's out there providing these documents. So Nixon sends his plumbers to go burglarize the office of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist to try and get some dirt, dig some stuff up about Daniel Ellsberg to discredit him. It fails, but nonetheless, the White House plumbers kind of set the stage for what's going to happen later in Nixon's presidency. So what's the next kind of major thing for Nixon? Well, it's the 1972 presidential election, right? So 1968, he wins. 1972, he's up for a second term, possibly. And how is Nixon feeling about it? Not great. Let's think about it. Why? Well, in 1960, Nixon ran for president, and he lost. By how much? 0.1%, right? Look at this. Moving my little cursor over here, right? JFK, he won in 1960 by 0.1%, 49.7%. Nixon lost, right? Super, super narrow margin. He also barely won in 1968 to become president, right? So Nixon does not want to lose in 1972, and he knows that it really could go either way. With these Pentagon Papers, with this kind of battle with the public, he knows that he has to do a lot to preserve his public image, but also try to dig up some dirt on what the opposition is doing. So Nixon's re-election campaign is primarily kind of driven by the White House plumbers, who add on some more former FBI, some more former CIA people, and they form the Committee for the Re-election of the President, aka CREEP. What a great acronym, huh? Very trustworthy. So the Committee for the Re-election of the President, CREEP, their goal is, well, they're a fundraising committee. Officially, they're just there to raise funds for his political campaign. In reality, they're there to make sure Nixon wins by any means necessary. What are those means? Well, they use money laundering, they create kind of fake government bank accounts, slush funds, they dig up dirt on rivals, they kind of manipulate the press, manipulate the media coverage over his rivals, really kind of dirty tricks to try and ensure his re-election, to ensure his victory. How else do they try to do that? Well, this is where we're getting to the meat of it. They try to break in to the Democratic headquarters. Let's dig into that. So, June 1972. We're leading up to the election, or to the actual voting day in November. What's happening? Well, we see 5 men who are arrested attempting to try and break into the Democratic Party headquarters inside the Watergate Hotel building. That's what Watergate is. Watergate is a hotel, it's a building, and that's where the Democratic Party headquarters was. Actually, these 5 guys had already broken in once before, and they planted listening devices in the phones, right? So they were listening there. Something had gone wrong with those listening devices, so this time they were breaking in for a second time to fix those listening devices, right? So they were basically listening in on what the opposition, what the other side was doing, to try and figure out, okay, here's what they're going to be trying to do, what they're going to try to do. That way we can counteract that. Nonetheless, those 5 guys are arrested, and they are eventually prosecuted. One of the men in these 5 men is the head of security for the Republican Party. That's who that yellow arrow is pointing to. And it turns out these guys are actually members of CREEP. Now remember, CREEP is not directly associated with Nixon, right? Like they're a separate organization and they are there, they just so happen to like support Nixon and want Nixon to be elected by any means necessary. Regardless, this is kind of a big scandal, and Nixon tries to deny that they had any involvement. They're like, those 5 guys, those are completely separate, don't know them. I would never kind of do anything like that or approve of anything like that. So here, by the way, is the Watergate Hotel. Neat shape, I guess. So, election of 1972, how does it work out? Does CREEP actually help Nixon? Yeah, they actually do a pretty decent job. I mean, let's look at that. Nixon represents the red here, and Nixon crushes it. Look at that. Popular vote, Nixon wins 60% approval. His opponent, George McGovern, wins 37.5. I mean, yeah, Nixon absolutely had a strong support, was able to manipulate the press. George McGovern, we see there in this image, he loses for a couple reasons. One, Nixon was able to successfully paint him as an extreme leftist. He was able to paint this guy, George McGovern from South Dakota. He was able to paint him as like, yeah, he's just another one of the hippies. I mean, clearly, look at this guy. That's a hippie right there. He definitely went out to Woodstock. No. But also, George McGovern's platform was really only about ending the Vietnam War. So not a huge platform there. Not really enough to build a strong base, right? So, 1972, Nixon wins. He's able to successfully deflect those accusations that he's involved in the Watergate break-in. Things are going well, if you're Nixon, right? Or so we think. Ooh. So, remember, those 5 guys were ex-FBI, ex-CIA people, and Nixon is doing his best to try and silence those people. He's paying them off, right? So like Nixon secretly is like paying these guys off. He tried to have the CIA stop the FBI from investigating the Watergate break-in any further. They tried bribing the burglars into silence. And meanwhile, the public has no idea this is going on. Nixon's approval ratings have never been higher. And of course, we see that he wins the 1972 election in an absolute landslide. Regardless, the defendants plead guilty or they're found guilty. Remember, Nixon has kind of secured their silence for now, and the Congress tries to sentence these burglars to long prison terms to try and get them to cooperate in these hearings, right? They're giving these guys long prison sentences saying like, look, you could reduce these prison sentences. You just need to tell us who sent you, who's in charge here, right? And so far, Nixon's been kind of successful in buying their silence. Well, we have some factors here that lead to a breakdown in those bribes, and that lead to a breakdown in Nixon being able to control things here. For one, we've got these 2 reporters, Woodward and Bernstein, Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein. They were assigned to investigate the Watergate break-in, and during their investigation, they learn that the story actually goes a little bit deeper, that it wasn't just a burglary. They begin to find out that there's a bigger kind of cover-up, a bigger scandal here going on, right? So we've got Woodward and Bernstein, these 2 private journalists, they don't work for the government, but they are investigating the story and also like kind of publishing these details out to the public. So now the public is starting to get an inside look at, Nixon seems to kind of be back up to some of the things that we saw in his first term. It seems like he's back up to those things again. Meanwhile, the Senate now has started to get some information. The Senate, Congress, who is doing those investigations, they begin to learn, because those 5 guys, one of the burglars, he started to get unhappy, he starts leaking information. They learn that Nixon potentially knew about the cover-up. And that's really what Watergate is about. It's not about the break-in. It's not about the burglary. It's about the aftermath, where Nixon tried to do a cover-up. And he didn't want anyone to know that he actually, in reality, he wanted this to happen, right? He wanted this burglary to happen, right? This is a huge bombshell. So, Woodward and Bernstein, they're doing their investigation. They end up working with a top secret informant for 30 years. No one knew who this guy was. Later, we found out that the deputy director of the FBI was involved in helping those reporters in their investigation. Meanwhile, the Senate is doing their own investigation. People are starting to leak information. And among that information that gets leaked is the fact that Nixon had a secret recording system in the Oval Office, in the presidential Oval Office. Nixon had set up this secret recording system. So after that whole Pentagon Papers debacle where things were leaked out, Nixon gets paranoid and he's like, you know what? I'm going to set up my own recording system so that anytime I have a meeting in my office, it's recorded and it's on tape. And I'm not going to share it with anyone. I'm the president. These are my tapes, and I'm not going to share them with anyone. So it's revealed that Nixon has a recording system. So Congress is immediately like, okay, well, if we can just get those tapes, that'll clear everything up, right? If Nixon is as honest as he's saying he is, that he wasn't involved, all we have to do is listen to these tapes, hand us the tapes, we'll listen to them, and if Nixon's being truthful, then we shouldn't hear anything about Watergate, anything about a burglary in those tapes. It should be easy, right? Nixon, though, says, I'm not going to hand over those tapes. Those are my tapes. I'm the president, and this is my presidential privilege to record my meetings, to make my own notes, right? So Congress forces Nixon to appoint a special prosecutor to investigate Watergate. Who's that prosecutor's name is Archibald Cox. You can see this guy in the picture, right? He looks all business. And Archibald Cox is like, okay, Nixon, you have to release those White House tapes. And Nixon is like, no, not only am I not going to release those tapes, but I am going to fire you. What? Right? So Nixon is like, kind of, he's trying to keep his cool, but he just fired the guy who's supposed to be investigating him. And actually, he wanted to fire him directly. He couldn't, so he forced someone else to fire him. That guy said, no, I'm not going to fire the special prosecutor. He resigns, and then Nixon he's trying to find someone to fire this guy. Eventually, he fires him. But regardless, this leads to a series of resignations, a series of firings known as the Saturday Night Massacre, right? This, happens on a Saturday. People are losing their jobs. Pretty quickly, the White House is starting to lose people. And in the midst of this, Nixon still maintains his innocence. Nixon is still like, I am not a crook. Maybe you've heard him say that. If you haven't, you're about to. Let's go to the clip. I'll put the link here just in case you don't feel like watching it here, but hey, why not? See, we got the sound. All right, let's take a listen. Nixon, how's he doing during this investigation?
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes. But in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got. President? Yes, sir.
Well, there you go. He said he's not a crook, so clearly he must be innocent. Why would he lie? So let's jump back into the notes. Let's see, how does this turn out for old Richard Nixon? Well, it doesn't turn out great. So the Supreme Court gets involved, and Congress begins to move forward with their impeachment hearings, right? Impeachment, right? The removal of the president. So for one, Congress decides, yes, there is sufficient evidence at this point to go to an impeachment vote. They don't vote to impeach Nixon, right? The vote actually doesn't happen, but there is support for the vote to take place, right? So Nixon is not impeached, but they were going to, right? The wheels were in motion. It seems pretty likely at this point that if that vote happens, Nixon is not only going to be impeached, he's probably going to be convicted, and he's probably going to be removed from office. How do we gain enough evidence to do that? Nixon is eventually forced by the Supreme Court to release those tapes, his secret Oval Office White House tapes. Nixon is forced to release those tapes, and the Supreme Court famously says, no one is above the law. Not even the president. No one is above the law. Nixon, you do not have a special presidential privilege. That is not a thing. You do not get that when it comes to evidence as part of an investigation. So Nixon is forced to release those tapes. And in those tapes, we learn that, yes, he had full knowledge of the break-in. He had full knowledge of the burglary at the Watergate Hotel. He had full knowledge of the cover-up. He said that they needed to do whatever it took to keep that from leaking out to the public. Hey, regardless, turns out it leaked out to the public. So it reveals Nixon's involvement in the Watergate cover-up. And Nixon, before the impeachment vote can take place, he resigns, right? He says, like, basically, you cannot fire me. I'm just going to go ahead and quit. I'm going to step down. He resigns. He's the first president to resign, to leave the office of president. And Gerald Ford is then sworn in as the new president. Gerald Ford, of course, one of his first acts is to pardon Nixon for any and all crimes. So Nixon, in the end, is not prosecuted for anything, even though he stepped down, even though he could have been held liable, held responsible for what happened. The guy who takes over for him, Gerald Ford, he pardons Nixon for any and all crimes. What else happens? Well, all those other government officials, everyone in creep, the White House plumbers, those guys do end up being charged, and about 48 of them are found guilty and sentenced to prison. Sentenced to prison sentences, right? Societally, the work of Woodward and Bernstein, those newspaper journalists, that work is respected. They win a Pulitzer Prize for their reporting work. And of course, we begin to see societal distrust of the government. We begin to see people really beginning to solidify their doubt about the government, their doubt about future wars. And, you know, we kind of see that even today, right? So we see the origin of Watergate. We see where the kind of distrust of the government comes from. We see the effect that a presidential scandal can have. We see that the Supreme Court holds here, in a Supreme Court case called U.S. v. Nixon, that no one is above the law, not even the president. Watergate. All right, nice work. That's the end. Go on to the next part in the lesson. Good to see you. Go wash your hands. Talk to you later.